Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another fantastic session this afternoon at our symposium. This session is going to be focusing on assessing youth engagement with violent extremism. Our first presentation of the session is going to be given to you by Stephen Barracosa, and he's going to be talking about radicalised youth, vulnerability and risk within an evolving Australian context. Stephen, you have 20 minutes. Take it away. You're on mute, Stephen. Yeah.
I'm here. Sorry, Emily. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for your intro, and thank you guys for having me. I think it goes without saying it's been a really incredible couple of days of content so far. And with a bit of luck, I can add something new and something slightly different over the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to take a slightly different approach, if that's okay. And I'm going to jump out of the world of academia and provide, I suppose, a practitioner-based reflection on some of our experiences on the ground in an Australian context, in our views and our conceptualisation of the process of youth radicalisation, some of the challenges that we've faced, and some of what might happen next. With a bit of luck, this might be a precursor to, I guess, some opportunities in the months and years to come of presentations looking at some primary source data in relation to radicalised Australian youth. So really quickly, 20 minutes is scarcely enough time to get through the content we'd love to get through. I'll have a really quick look at the Youth Justice New South Wales countering violent extremism context from a practitioner-based lens, our view of the state of youth radicalisation literature, certainly how we conceptualise the process of youth radicalisation, and maybe pose some questions around what some implications might be moving forward for youth-specific CVE policy and practices. Really quickly, I just wanted to touch on the term youth because, like a lot of terminology in this space, it's used broadly, often interchangeably, and often in a number of different ways. So you can find references across policy, practice, and literature in relation to youth, from young children to young adults. From a Youth Justice New South Wales perspective, we're really interested in young people that have embarked on a trajectory towards extremism before the age of 18, and young people that have come into contact with CVE services and programs before the age of 18. So the context really quickly for us is we're in a really unique position in the state of New South Wales here in Australia, where we have a youth-specific CVE framework for our youth criminal justice system in youth detention and community supervision settings. It's a highly practitioner-based framework geared towards hands-on, dynamic, very engaging processes to support staff and external stakeholders to effectively identify youth that may be on a trajectory towards extremism, certainly to understand how and why they're heading in that direction, and most importantly, to draw up very layered, multidisciplinary, multifaceted case management and intervention type frameworks to effectively and efficiently divert, disengage and move young people as far away from this space and as effectively and efficiently as we possibly can. Like a lot of frameworks, we work across what we call the spectrum of radicalisation, from the very pointy end of the stick, a small number of youth that you would describe as highly radicalised with a clear action orientation towards ideologically motivated violence. It includes a numerically small number of youth that were charged and convicted for terrorism offences before the age of 18. I would argue tooth and nail that that pointy end of the spectrum probably doesn't characterise the work we're doing on the ground in terms of youth radicalisation. And we actually spend a lot more time as practitioners at the front end of that spectrum in what we term the at-risk space. It's worth noting that we're not a social cohesion program. We're not geared towards building resilient communities. We are very much a client-focused framework. And as such, we term at-risk in terms of a couple of key pieces. The first is a young, inherently vulnerable person in and around the CVE landscape, but the second is exposure to extremism, and that's the real kicker for us. So without exposure, our CVE framework doesn't receive endorsement to engage young people here in the state of New South Wales. We're working a lot, like most CVE services and programs, across that spectrum of religious and ideologically motivated violence. And we have what I would argue is a rather unique cohort. So the criminal justice space, in a youth sense, across most of the Western world is characterised by relatively small numbers, but a youth cohort with pronounced psychosocial disadvantage, developmental deficits, a number of life course challenges and a pre-existing action orientation towards violence when compared to their same-aged peers. And I guess in really simple terms, we reflect on our cohort as an incredibly complex, incredibly layered group of young people that have a range of inherently difficult and challenging needs. In some respects, exposure to extremism and inspiration, commitment, motivation to extremism is really the last thing most of these young people need. So the work we're conducting in an Australian context is really falling under a climate that's mirrored for the most part across the Western world. We know that extremist groups are effectively recruiting, radicalising and mobilising young people. We know that Australian youth are being radicalised at an increasingly young age. Unfortunately, we know that a numerically small number of Australian youth have been implicated in terrorism plots here in a domestic sense. Arguably the most, or one of the most identifiable terrorist incidents that we've had on Australian soil was perpetrated in October 2015 by an Australian citizen who was aged just 15 years old at the time. We know that we've had Australian youth join international conflicts. We've had Australian youth appear in online propaganda promoting violence against the West. And we know that as a result, like lots of the Western world at this point in time, that at-risk and radicalised youth are assuming an increasing level of presence and relevance across CVE programs and services. More broadly, from an academic and policy perspective, I think there has been some fairly broad and somewhat confronting concessions in recent years where, whilst we wish we weren't talking about this topic, the reality is that radicalised youth pose a notable, enduring, and to some degree growing threat for the international community. So, from a practice-based perspective, looking out at the available body of youth radicalisation research, what exactly do we know? It's broadly described as an emerging area of interest. From the ground, we would challenge that somewhat, and we would argue that in the 2 decades leading up to 9/11, you can find some of the most youth-centric and youth-relevant references in regards to attempts to explain violent extremism, to explain trajectories towards terrorist behaviour. We know that there's some incredible research in, I guess, the initial iteration of far-right groups and movements from a Western sense coming out of North America and parts of Europe in that pre-9/11 era, where we learn lots about different profiles and different contextual influences and different susceptibilities that has been kind of mirrored in a lot of research post 9/11. So we've seen some incredible work come out of places like Palestine. The cubs of the caliphate have been referenced extensively in the last couple of days. In more recent years, we've seen some incredible subsamples and reflections upon youth radicalisation towards foreign fighter type involvement. Ultimately, we still face the challenge of generalisation in terms of how we understand youth radicalisation in different contexts. Australia ultimately has a degree of geographical isolation that has prevented large numbers of Australians engaging in foreign conflicts. We're not under the rule of a terrorist organisation and we don't have occupied territories. So whilst it's illuminating and incredible to watch the research unfold in some other contexts, there is probably scope for us to understand our own backyard in a little bit more depth and some of the unique environmental nuances that are contributing to youth being exposed to and influenced by extreme groups in our own backyard. I would also argue that whilst we're conscious that there are clear research limitations across the sphere of radicalisation and violent extremism, it might be particularly pronounced for the study of youth radicalisation. They are not an easily identifiable cohort. They are certainly not an easily accessible cohort. And those challenges appear likely to endure moving forward for some time to come. We would also argue from a practice-based perspective, looking out through a practice lens on the available body of youth radicalisation research, that there is an inherent focus on violent extremism, on the small number of young people that have engaged in violent extremist or terrorist offences. Given that we're working here in the state of New South Wales on the ground across that really broad spectrum of youth radicalisation, we would argue that maybe the literature is too focused on violent extremism, too focused on terrorism offenders, and it isn't adequately capturing some of those non-violent radicalisation type trajectories, which probably characterises most of the young people that we've worked with in recent years. Having said all of that, I suppose from a practitioner-based perspective, one of the consistencies that we see, whether by design, whether we're looking for it, or whether just by chance, is that throughout most reflections on radicalised youth, whether that be violent or non-violent, there is a fairly consistent theme around the notion of vulnerability. From a practice-based and a youth-specific CVE perspective, we might argue that vulnerability isn't such a bad takeoff point to help us understand and conceptualise why a small cohort of Australian youth are firstly being exposed to extremism, bearing in mind that that exposure is key for our CVE framework to become involved, and also secondly to understand why that cohort is also then influenced or susceptible to being influenced following their exposure to extremism. On the ground, vulnerability is clearly an individually specific and developmentally informed type construct. We think it helps us understand, we think it helps us explain, but we certainly feel like it helps us draw up frameworks to address some of those deficits. to incorporate robust and multidisciplinary case management and intervention type frameworks. But whilst vulnerability is a really nice takeoff point to understand why young people are popping up in this space, one of the great challenges that we're facing is that we see vulnerability not as a risk mitigating factor, but under the wrong circumstances, potentially for youth, as quite a risk promoting construct. So if we had $1 for every conversation that went something to the effect of, she's 15, CVE doesn't need to worry about this. He's 14, this is not the business of CVE. I think we're missing the fact that young people with behavioural dysfunction, with poor behavioural controls, with intermittent periods of emotional dysregulation, with a lack of consequential thinking, under the wrong circumstances, in the wrong situations, we would argue from a CVE perspective that those vulnerabilities are actually quite concerning for a small number of young people that are both being exposed and influenced by extremism, and whether that be in a non-violent or violent sense. For us, youth vulnerability is potentially quite risk promoting in some ways, and it's a challenging conversation for youth agencies and practitioners that tend to see youth through a very vulnerable centric lens, but usually as a risk mitigating type construct. Couple of case studies really quickly, and they're slightly different and slightly extreme in different ways, I suppose, but just to display how vulnerability factors into the way that we're processing and thinking about some of the young people that we're working with. The first case study is for a male aged 16 years old who was ultimately charged and convicted for terrorism offences here in New South Wales. We conceptualise his kind of life history and life course experiences specifically in relation to vulnerability through a lack of pluralism that was modelled by family and those around him, a genuine lack of bond to Australian society throughout much of his upbringing, for the most part in the absence of hostility, disaffection or any form of grievance towards Australian society, but just a genuine lack of connection. We see a fairly pronounced process of permissive parenting styles, lots of unsupervised and unstructured time, obviously leaving him open to exposure to certain people in certain pockets of society where his sense of self is developing given his age. And he also had a very unique personality profile where there were some traits which left him in a slightly difficult position when it came to accepting blame for his misconduct or accepting responsibility for his personal transgressions. None of that's radicalisation centric, none of that's CVE specific, but we then have a process where he's being exposed to extremism and socialised to Sunni Islamist or Salafi jihadi type thinking in and around the Islamic State organisation, firstly through immediate family, then through extended family, more broadly through some local Islamist institutions, and then certainly through a really pronounced and quite aggressive online digital footprint. Long after the fact, we see the ideology emerging. We see the presence of personal and group grievances. We see dehumanising rhetoric, threatening rhetoric. And I suppose ultimately you would describe this young man at one point in time as highly radicalised with a clear action orientation towards ideologically motivated violence. Now, we feel like vulnerability is a useful point to understand how we got there, why he was susceptible to being exposed to some of that content. And certainly there's elements of our case management framework that are geared towards addressing some of those weaknesses, some of those soft spots, and strengthening his skill set and his resilience to not be exposed to or influenced by those things down the track. There's also obviously some very ideological heavy elements to his case management framework around religious re-education and theological mentoring and support and so on. But we think at the very pointy end of the stick, for a clearly violent, radicalised young man, vulnerability is certainly helpful for helping us to understand how we got there and what we might do to prevent it from happening again. Second case study, non-terrorism offender, extremely different profile. And I guess we conceptualise this case in the context of vulnerability in relation to an autism spectrum disorder, a young man with a pronounced history of social isolation and marginalisation, certainly evidence of periods of low moods, low self-esteem, intermittent periods of emotional dysregulation. It's a young person that had a history of interest, query fixations in relation to the military, in relation to firearms, and a young person that had very few specific, tangible or realistic future plans or goals. A case riddled with vulnerabilities, but not yet riddled with anything from a CVE perspective. The concerns arose on the back of him being exposed to and consuming extreme right-wing content online. We know that some of that was occurring through both violent video game forums and also through overtly extreme kind of far right-wing type games along a white supremacist type line of thinking. His vulnerabilities almost prevented in-person associations, but there was certainly some inspiration and association developed through those chat rooms. We later, after the fact, see the emergence of a degree of nationalist and anti-authority type rhetoric. Unfortunately, this particular young man embarked on a trajectory of producing a 3D firearm. And we find ourselves from a youth CVE perspective talking lots about vulnerability in relation to this case, and awfully confused in some respects about whether we're talking about non-violent radicalisation. Should we be concerned about an action orientation towards ideologically motivated violence in a violent radicalisation type sense? We're talking about fixations. Are we talking about none of the above? That kind of layered, highly vulnerable, where does the risk lie type profile arguably characterises more of the work that we're doing than that clearly indoctrinated, ideologically grounded, committed to violent extremism youth profile. So, just to play on, I suppose, the title of this conference, I would argue that to some degree, the youth CVE landscape here in Australia is at somewhat of a crossroads. We know that CVE services more broadly have really wrestled with how do we engage young people? How do we assess young people? How do we case manage and effectively intervene with young people in the absence of labels, in the absence of stigma, in the absence of attributing immutable characteristics to young people? And there isn't an easy answer for that. In our experience, vulnerability is the language of youth agencies. It's the language of youth practitioners. And given that we feel that it helps us understand exposure and influence and susceptibility to extremism, it's not such a bad takeoff point to engage those in and around the young people that we're working with. It tends to make CVE more digestible. It tends to make the notion of radicalisation a little bit softer. And I guess in our experience, it's opened up a significant amount of opportunity for consultation, for collaboration, for an increased degree of transparency in and around our youth CVE framework. And I suppose in some respects reduces the strength and the fear factor that often comes with CVE on the ground, particularly from a youth perspective. I think then the role of CVE is to slowly and delicately introduce some discussions about how vulnerability certainly helps us explain the case, but also helps us understand how we build a risk profile and we formulate a case management framework around the work that needs to be done. So, just to cap off some of that thinking, those that know me know that I would argue tooth and nail until the sun goes down that we approach youth differently in most walks of life, certainly in a criminal justice sense, that's a given. I think if we conceptualise vulnerability as somewhat relevant to help us understand how and why youth are engaging in an extremism, both from a non-violent and violent perspective, then maybe there's scope for a youth-specific lens on the process of radicalisation. And there's certainly scope to conceptualise both vulnerability and risk for radicalisation, risk for violent extremism risk, all on one kind of slightly awkward, extremely convoluted, but very youth-centric playing field. I think there's scope, if we'd like to effectively engage and intervene with youth across that spectrum of radicalisation, for there to be youth-specific CVE policy and practices. Without question, there are enduring research needs. I think we've had a number of presenters over the last few days make mention of life course experiences and processes and qualitative life course type data. Given the recency of life course experiences for a lot of the young people that we're working with, it mightn't be such a bad place to take off in terms of the future of youth radicalisation research. And I suppose the last question that I might pose, and I don't have the answer for this, and if I'm honest, it's way above my pay grade, but is CVE the right term? Is countering violent extremism a helpful term for those of us working across that spectrum of youth radicalisation? Does CVE come with connotations? Is it too hot? Is it too heavy to some degree? Does it capture notions of early identification, early intervention, diversion and preventative opportunities that tend to characterise a lot of the work that we do on the ground on a daily basis? I genuinely don't have the answer for that. But it's a conversation that we're having more regularly and more frequently here on the ground in the state of New South Wales in Australia. And I wonder whether there isn't some scope for us to consider that and to explore that a little bit further in a little bit more depth as we move forward. So I think that's a bit of content in a 20-minute span. I'm conscious that I probably haven't taken a breath, but I can't thank you guys enough for having me this afternoon. I look forward to having the opportunity to catch up in person at some stage down the track in a somewhat post-COVID world. Thanks again for having me, and I'll hang around and hopefully there's some questions at the end of this session.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was so interesting. I felt like I actually learned a lot, even though I've been looking at the vulnerability world for a long time. So our next presentation is titled A Statistical Framework for Assessing the Strength of Risk Assessment Instruments on Juveniles, Teens and Young Adults during an Important Cognitive Development Phase. Our presenter today is Dr. David Kernot, and he is presenting on behalf of his co-authors who are Dr. Mohammed Ibqal and Associate Professor Debra Smith. Take it away, David. You have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Hopefully people can see that.
Yes.
Right, thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, Steve, thanks for an excellent presentation before this one. You really set the scene for a little bit of the work that we're doing here as well within Victoria University. And I might just add that I'd like to also recognise Dr. Kate Burrell from Street in Melbourne, because some of the ideas and thoughts in this presentation have sort of had a bit of a look over from her. So I just appreciate her input as well. Yeah, so this is a presentation, it's quite statistical. It's probably going to bore a lot of people, but I'm actually going to try and compress about 35 pages of analysis into 4 key slides, and conscious of the time, I'll probably talk faster than I normally do. So here goes. Yeah, so obviously setting the landscape here. ASIO, obviously in their latest assessment of reporting that there's more of an increased security risk. Today in the news, I read that a 14-year-old was arrested last month in Melbourne, and they went to court today, fixated with Islamic State, and letters that they found that he'd written suggested he was trying to blow up his school and shoot his teachers. So obviously the problem isn't going away at all. And yeah, I'm just highlighting the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, where they raised the issue around the difficulties in ranking current risk assessment instruments. So what we're trying to do here today, or in this presentation, is to highlight some work that we've done to try and mitigate some of those issues around age in particular, a younger age, and the plethora, it's not really a plethora, but the large amount of different tools that are available for practitioners. So just a quick thing here, just to highlight that, you know, there is a fall in the average age of Australian terrorist cohort. And I'm just highlighting a paper by Shannon Hogan-Harris and Kate Burrell, where they talk about how age has been reduced. So what they're saying there is basically over a period of time, the average age has dropped to 20.3 years, down from 28.2 years of age. So what we're seeing now with more people in the cohort, there's actually a dropping and a falling of the average age of terrorists in Australia. And according to the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security report, the latest one, they're raising the issue that since 2014, there's been a number more outside of the report that I just quoted that have that are going through the courts basically. And so, yeah, this is just trying to emphasize why we're looking at age. And yeah, and we're raising an interesting thing, I believe, whereas we're suggesting that we should be looking at 25 as the new cutoff point for adulthood. So, and so what we've done in this study is we've actually broken down the cohort into under 18s, under 20, which you typically see, and then actually under 26, and we've taken that whole group and compared it to the rest of the data in our study. We think there might be differences in the age assessments, and so, you know, you can probably tailor those. And psychologists are suggesting that adolescence runs up until the age of 25. And, you know, there are a number of issues now that weren't around, say, 10, 20 years ago, such as the high cost of education, very high cost of housing. And it's more generally accepted now that you don't turn 18, become an adult magically, leave home. We get a lot more of these people that, you know, fail to launch will become boomerangs, to quote Burns and Soki from one of their papers. So yeah, we're just highlighting that we're going to be looking at 26 as our cohort. There are legal differences, obviously, between when a person is an adult, but we're going to say that their cognitive development continues through to 25, 26, and we should treat them differently. Guys on motorbikes and cars, especially under the age of 26, that certainly get treated differently in insurance companies, and the whole raft of different things around neuropsychological evidence to suggest that there's a whole different mindset going on in people under the age of 25, not 18. And so I'm going to leave these references right at the end for people to look at in the slowness of time. So we've drawn on the ASP database, the Applied Security Science Partnership database from Victoria University, under the great work of Deb Smith and Mohammed, in particular, driving forces in this database. There's 92 cases. It's been collected from open source Collect, so court documents, media reports, and they've got a great team in the ASP working on this, including people from Victoria Police and where I'm from in Defence Science Technology Group. Obviously, the data is all anonymised and we've got ethics approval. And today, we're looking at around 230 behavioural indicators across tools such as TRAP18, the VERA tool, radar. We've also had a look at ERG22 and a person of interest prioritisation protocol. Today, we're not using all of those. We are actually also, the study focuses on age, so I should highlight that. And it's using all of these indicators across a range of assessment tools. So we're actually not trying to compare the different instruments. What we're trying to do is to collectively look at the broader amount of indicators and use all of them and compare them against age. And just something which is important, obviously, just because something's not statistically significant doesn't mean that there's a problem with the indicator at all. It's just, in this study, we've used indicators that are statistically significant to 0.05 as a p-value in this study, but it does not indicating that there's any issues with generally these indicators overall, and we're looking at it from an age perspective. So I just wanted to highlight that. And quickly, our methodology. So we're taking a grounded theory approach. We don't know what we're going to find, or we didn't when we started this study. We examined the different effects that youth has on different on these different indicators and different age groups. So we're looking at people, as I said, under 18, under 20, and under 26, but we've also grouped the years into 2-year blocks as well, just to give us some more fidelity with the data to see what it will show us. And as it says in the screen here, we're looking at the radar risk assessment tool, TRAP18, the VERA tool, and a person of interest prioritization protocol used in a policing context. And basically, as I've just talked about, we've broken people down to juveniles, teenagers, and young adults, with the interesting combination there that we're looking at young adults being 20 to 26 as well. So, a bit older than you typically look at with studies. And as I've just highlighted there, we've got some separate age categories to give us some fine-grained views. We've used ANOVA and SPSS as the tool to do the statistics. We're using the partial eta squared measure to basically look at characterizing the effects as small, medium, and large. And what that refers to, obviously, is things that have significant observable differences between the groups that we're looking at across these different indicators. And finally, rather than trying to describe the thematic high-level groups of these indicators across, these 4 or 5 tools, what we've done is we've used a Department of Defence publication, which has actually got 12 thematic categories, and we've already looked at a range of these tools, and so we're using those, and those 12 categories and the details are at the very end of the presentation, and hopefully you can read those in another time perhaps. But that's the approach that we've taken, and again, just to stress the age, In the ASP database, 61% of the data are from people under the age of 26. We've used 92 records or samples in the analysis cases, and there is something that which we can't really do anything about, but we've only got 3 people under the age of 18, and this isn't unusual, obviously, in an open source kind of study because of the Privacy Act and the issues concerned around people under the age of 18 and getting hold of that data. So there is actually an opportunity there to sort of improve on this study by using closed sources, but not for this reporting today, obviously. And yeah, so what we basically did, and I'll spend a bit of time on this because this is kind of one of the crux of what we did, is that we had a look at the 4 tools, and in the top layer, or the top chart, if you like, they're basically all of the high level indicators, or the indicators that had a very high rating as far as the strengths go, about being able to separate ages. And as you can see, most of it is the under 20-year-old, 18 to 19, or under 18 age categories. And there's not much in the older cohort there. When you look at the middle slide, you can see basically that we've introduced, from orange, we've now introduced this kind of pinky color to highlight the medium strength indicators. And as you can see, and also in the orange ones, if they've also pink, we've highlighted them with a bold red in this case to sort of show that the stronger ones are even stronger. And so in the middle slide, you see that it's filling in quite nicely as far as the indicators go to identify differences in people around these different age groups. But there's a bit of a gap in the 20 to 21 and a little bit in the 22 to 23-year-old age category. That seems interesting. We thought so. And then in the bottom screen, you can see that there's the light blue indicates the very lower rate of strength in the effects. But again, we've got a little, it's pretty light on in the 20 to 21-year-old category. And that was one of the findings that we wanted to highlight in this study around these tools. And so just briefly, because I'm going to run out of time otherwise, this is just showed the 52 significant indicators across those themes that I highlighted. And so here, I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise for many people in this field, but intention is a key theme for those under 18. For those under 20, violent ideology is a key theme, with high pro-social relations likely having a limiting effect. And again, for those under 26, intent and capacity are key themes to violent extremism. And again, the next slide is just the same thing again, so I won't dwell on that. We're just looking at the weightings that we've aggregated this time. And when we did a comparison to what I just mentioned, the story is slightly different, but only slightly in the under 20 age group. We see that the influence of harmful relations is slightly higher than the pro-social effects, but overall the same themes just mentioned are otherwise similar. And so, yeah, we had a look at the themes across the different groups, and that's basically, I've just highlighted those things about our observations. So we found psychopathy, mental health issues was pretty significant in the under 18 group. Otherwise, they were no different to the whole cohort. Yeah, good relational pro-social influences played an increasing difference in the under 20, but more strongly significant in the under 26 cohort. And conversely, bad relation influences had an impact in the under 18-year-old, but the strength of the influence of those relationships weakened, but it was still significant when compared to those over the age of 26. So yeah, very high intent for those under 18, which remains high in the under 20s and the under 26 group, and violent ideology is very high in the 18 to 20 age category. Now, it probably doesn't really make a lot of sense if you're not looking at all the data that I've shown previously, so I won't spend too much time on that. and I'm just going to flip through. So yeah, ideology is higher in the under 20s than the under 26s. Social grievances and isolation from the mainstream society are seen in the under 20s. If you're under 18, you don't have the same capacity, but there's an increase in capacity from 20 to 26. These are probably pretty clear for most people. And then there are 23 different indicators unique to these different age groups. And they're around relational capacity and isolation from mainstream society in the 20 to 21 year age group. There are 3 unique indicators there, or themes. And in the 20 to 23 year old age group, 4 of the 5 indicators are unique around relational activities, psychopathy, antisocial, criminal behavior, and social grievances. And that was that one. So yeah, quickly, some limitations. The coders weren't all trained in all of the tools, but the coding was consistent across all of the calls and intercoder workshops we used to sort of iron out a lot of those issues. But a lot of the people were limited. Well, yeah, we were limited to open source material. The data was entered after the arrest and the attack, so there is a potential for bias. And it's pretty limited in the under 18 cohort as well, as we've already highlighted there. But yeah, I suppose one of the things is, at least we think that there's a good range of human science background, sociologists, psychologists, and violent extremism research specialists. So that's been good. Yeah, we found that you could have a look at the age category statistically, and you could tell a story there. We found a bit of a limitation with TRAP overall on this data set. It has a number of implications. In the pre-crime assessment, the under 20s may be more influenced by harmful peers, mitigating general protective factors such as supportive family that may impact on prioritisation. POI prioritisation could take into account of the increased action orientations of those under 26, despite the potential for lower ideological indicators between 20 to 26. Under 18s may demonstrate a high level of ideology and intent that might not necessarily demonstrate high levels of other assessment indicators such as capability. But I've almost run out of time, I realise that. So I'm going to have to just highlight that using the partial eta² metrics is a way to show significant differences in different age groups, we think. These tools are effective and people should feel comfortable with their application in young people. Based on this research, there's an opportunity to treat those greater than 20 and less than 26 like young adults with support from trained youth practitioners, even though the law says they're adults. We've got a bit of time, so I'll just show you that there are the indicators there. There's the 12 of them that I spoke about. I have a number of references, which hopefully you can read when you have a look at the slides in the future. I think I've got too many slides and too much to say, so I'll quickly just touch on intervention and case study management. There is a potential to include a child and an adolescent specialist in assessing both suitability for CV intervention and needs analysis in the cases up to the age of 26. We think that we should be looking at the literature that says that people are developing still up until 26 rather than 21. So there is an opportunity for young people who participate in diversion programs. They're less likely to reoffend than those that go through the courts and are incarcerated. So there's an opportunity to sort of extend these programs into a cohort that might be a bit older, and that's a little bit radical. But that's one of the things that we found. And I suppose in the intervention and case management tertiary point, it might be appropriate to give more consideration to separating out the under 26-year-olds from the other violent extremists in prison to decrease the influence and increase the rehabilitation prospects. So we've suggested a couple of possibly contentious things here, which is being fed off the data. But yeah, I've put too many slides up and I haven't really done justice to the work of my colleagues. So hopefully you can ask them some really great questions. Thank you.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for that. Fascinating presentation. And I actually have a question for you myself, but I will wait until we do the Q&A. So the final paper that's being presented in this session is titled Youth Resilience Against Violent Extremism. Do Sociodemographic Characteristics Matter? Findings from a Perception Study in Sri Lanka. And we have three presenters for this paper. We have Emmanuel, Nene, Odjidja, André, Alves dos Reis, and Sanka Galagoda. Thank you so much, guys. You have 20 minutes and good luck. You might need to unmute yourself.
Yes, okay, sorry, I just had to turn on my video. Hi, everyone. Hi, colleagues. I'm really good morning from this part of the world, and I'm very pleased to be here. And so let me just share my screen. Just a sec, please. I guess you can see it now. Okay. All right. So basically, well, yeah, we have three colleagues speaking on this. To start with, we would be talking about the history and trends of radicalization in Sri Lanka. We'll also be looking at the methods and the findings of this study, and then looking at the conclusions and implications for programming that will be conducted by André. Just to talk about who we are as an organization, we are the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund based in Geneva, Switzerland. Currently, we do work in a number of countries as seen in the map. We have a total investment of about $40.2 million. We have just started a number of grants making in some other countries like the Sahel. We are running up a second round 2 in Tunisia, but most especially about Sri Lanka. We've just invested a small amount of $1 million, but here we're actually testing a new model of funding in that country. My colleague Sanka would start with the history of radicalization in Sri Lanka, and then I'll continue with the methodology, and André will come in with the conclusions. Sanka.
Thank you, Nene. I hope all of you can hear me. So I will start with a brief introduction on the historical background of youth radicalization in Sri Lanka before we move on to the findings of the study. From a historical perspective, youth radicalization in Sri Lanka can be divided into two main parts. Firstly, the radicalization of youth in the southern parts of Sri Lanka, the southern provinces of Sri Lanka. The youth which belong to the majority ethnic and religious groups. And secondly, the radicalization of youth groups in the northern parts of the country, which belong to mainly the minority religious and ethnic groups. So firstly, when we consider the southern youth who belong to the ethnic majority or the religious majority, the radicalization process of these youth started in the 1960s, the latter part of 1960s, where the emergence of a leftist political group called the Janata Vimukthi Peramuna was recruiting youth and spreading leftist rhetoric in the country. And given the situation in the country where most of the youth were frustrated because there was not enough opportunity for them to employ themselves, so the economic perspectives or the economic opportunities were less for the educated youth from the middle class rural families was very less. Youth were very frustrated with the existing regime, existing government, so they flocked with the JVP, and the JVP, the Janata Vimukthi Peramuna, the political group, was able to spread their rhetoric amongst the youth and gain their support in terms of like joining the cause. And unfortunately, this led to two insurrections within the country, one in 1971 and one in the later parts of 1980s. Both were met with force by the then governments who were in power, and they used military power. So there was a lot of devastation, and it was detrimental to the country's economy and the social context at the time. And we, up to this day, we experienced the negative effects of what happened during those particular decades. And when we consider the second part, actually, the radicalization of youth in the North, the radicalization of youth in the North it happened mainly in the 1970s with the introduction of discriminatory policies and laws in the country. However, in the build-up to it, the root causes stem from the colonial periods, where the nationalism became centered on ethno-nationalism instead of a community or a national identity. And religious identity and ethnic identity played a vital role in this creation of ethno-nationalism in the implementation of government policies in favor of the majoritarian Sinhalese community. There were several policies or institutional policy level decisions that were made by the government in the 1950s and the 1970s that created a sense of dissatisfaction with the Tamil northern youth groups, who then thought of like getting together and speaking against the government and asking for their rights, which they rightly deserve. So the culmination of these things led to the creation of the liberation of Tamil Tigers of Elam, or LTTE as they known, an ethno-nationalist separatist group which was non-violent at first with their approach to spreading their rhetoric, but subsequently, when it comes to in the 80s, particularly in the beginning of 1980, where there was a huge issue in the country, where an ethnic massacre was done, and after that point, it was very much violent progression towards their cause. And when we look at post-independence, we see in the years that followed, subsequent to the cessation of the armed conflict, Sri Lanka saw a rise of right-wing nationalist groups and religious groups which were particularly inclined towards religious extremism. So sporadic incidents of religious violence in various parts of the country also helped to popularize these rhetorics among the public, especially the most recent incident, the Easter Sunday attacks, which took place in April of 2019, was which it helped to re-emerge this sort of hate narratives within the country against particular religious groups. And we saw a rise of the use in social media as a tool through which these hate narratives and misinformation was shared. And concluding this, I would like to say that there is a need for community level and policy level and individual level changes which need to take place in the country in addressing these issues and moving forward from this particular situation that we are in. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I would like Nene to take on and continue with the rest of the presentation. Nene?
Thank you very much, Sanka. And so just against this backdrop is that we are looking to invest this amount of money, and we are just, and as a result of that, we want to kind of understand the factors that contributed to violent extremism, but and of course, resilience in against violent extremism in this context. This study was an embedded design. It was in the framework of a bigger study that we did, and it was among 2008 respondents between the ages of 15 to 29 in 6 districts of Sri Lanka. We used the Brave tool to collect data, and of course we had to translate this to the local dialect and back translated, pre-tested in field and all that. For the analysis for this particular presentation, it's in 2 stages. The first is an ANOVA, assessing the relationship between some demographic characteristics and the level of resilience. And the second is we just put everything in a multiple regression model to see how they interact and to see whether they are statistically still significant after that. In terms of the description of our participants, as you can see here, the mean age, we are 22.2. The distribution as well is reflective of the population of the various districts, and that is to say that the smallest was Barracosa, which we found also almost like a 50% split between men and women that participated in this study. Yeah, so let's just talk about the findings because we do not have time. We'll just touch on a few interesting things that emerged. So the first is that we saw that in terms of the level of resilience was really low in Colombo. That happens to be the capital city of Sri Lanka. And as you can see, the standard deviation here was quite huge in the sense that, you know, we saw extreme minimal and maximum values. And when you disaggregate this by the sub-districts, you realize that actually there were some sub-districts that were very, very low in terms of the resilience level to violent extremism, and some districts that were extremely high. And it kind of posed a lot of questions around whether or not, you know, what exactly, how do these two districts, although they are very close to themselves, vary in terms of their resilience to violent extremism. That is something that at the moment we are still investigating and understanding more. Also, as you can see here, people with PhDs, for instance, are really low in terms of resilience to violent extremism compared to people who have, let's say, primary education. And my colleague André will talk about a few implications. And also something we found very interesting was that among the police and people working with the armed forces, they were very, very, very high on resilience, and you know, and that is something that again struck us throughout this study. Also, in terms of disaggregating by what marital status, you see here that those that are single are those that were really, really resilient compared to those that were married. And again, that defies the literature of what we know as the contributing factors of what counts to violent extremism in especially in developing contexts like Sri Lanka. One interesting thing also had to do with the total satisfaction. So we asked people that, how do you feel with your present economic situation? And indeed, people that said we were totally satisfied, we found that they were also really low on their resilience to violent extremism. Now, you begin from all these findings, you begin to see that there is kind of a characteristic that is being played here. That is, people that are educated, well-to-do, quite critical, you know, economically stable are those that are less on violent extremism. In contrast to people that are less educated, you know, are part of the government mechanism or machinery, you know, to be very high on the spectrum. And so this is a question that we kind of kept asking, and my colleague André would further talk about this. Then a really interesting question. This question, we found ourselves like an hour discussing this and really trying to understand what's the dynamic that is being played here. That is, you know, to what extent does knowing your neighbor, you know, contributes to resilience to violent extremism. And what we found is that those that do not know their neighbors very well, you know, are those that are high compared to that those that know their neighbors so well, you know, are quite low. And so the question that we kind of asked to reflect as we move into the Q&A session is that in what ways that knowing your neighbor well contributes to resilience against violent extremism? Does it contribute more? Is it that because you know them, you know, you kind of want to you know what they're capable of doing, and so you do not trust them? And so these are dynamics that we want you to think about as we move on to the Q&A session. In terms of this, just the multiple regression is just to show that, of course, after putting all this together, how long someone has lived in the community was not significant. Religion of practice was not significant. Main source of information was not significant. Again, just to say that these variables are variables that were significant during the first stage of the analysis. And so, André, you have the floor now to talk about the conclusions and the major points we found from this study.
Thank you, Nene. I think the first preliminary that I have to say is that it's a preliminary study, so nothing saying here is like definitive. It's also, as I think my colleague said before, was focused on some districts of Sri Lanka, so it doesn't really represent Sri Lanka as a whole. So I think that's important, like cautionary comments to make. I think also, like, when you talk about lower and higher, it's like it's always relative, right? It's like not necessarily, because they all, as I said, my first point, all the resilience scores in a way of the brave fall relatively close on the 40s, right, across the whole survey, with the exception being the doctorate, the PhD, so it's like 30. So I think that was like majority is like 40, 41, 43, 44, and these levels. I think the second point is like some findings contradict what we would expect reading the literature, like, for example, single youth being more resilient, or like relatively more resilient than the ones who were married or widowed. I think that's an interesting conclusion, in a way that what you normally think as like the what to say, profile of people who join the groups. I think the third point is the satisfaction of life and doctorate. I think it's too early to tell, but there is, for me, some discussions, possible discussions with, even in the context of developing world like Sri Lanka, of post-materialism and critical view of society and resilience. So how much when you are satisfied, or when you have like your material needs satisfied, then you become much more critical, and then your level of resilience might decrease in a way because you care more about these more ideological considerations. The second slide. Yeah. I think in terms of programming, in terms of youth brave, I think there are three other points that I want to raise. One was that we found a little bit difficult in terms of the brave, was like, there was, in a way, when you are trying to apply the tool, was the collapse between the individual and the community. And for that, I would say, yeah, especially, I think the question number 8 that asks the community accepts use of violence as a way to solve problems. And that's something that happened in other cases we use brave as well, is that sometimes because we are applying brave in a way in communities that are in volatile landscapes, there is likelihood that this landscape shifts and become more violent, and then this question actually drags down the score, but doesn't necessarily mean that the people itself change, right? So that's a very interesting concept. I think the second point is about the cultural identity and connectedness. That's for when you apply for Sri Lanka, in other contexts, you apply also in Kenya before, was not very clear, like if that's more on that score actually means more resilience in that particular context, because like that is the cultural identity and connectedness that actually the V groups use as a way to recruit, as a way to promote their cause. So it's not very clear there if there was like, so I think some actually members of these groups actually have a high level of these characteristics. And finally, I think one of the main, and I think my main question throughout the study, and that's been a question before when I braved 14, it was the idea of how much we are measuring resilience against violent extremism, how much are we measuring actually conformity to power structures. So there are certain questions that says about how, if you trust authorities, if you feel comfortable, but often people who have very critical views of society and who can become activists, for example, for positive change, would also have very low scores in that particular categories. So I think in that case, how do we distinguish between people who are actually just critical and then they will actually be change agents for positive, than people who are actually more like vulnerable to violent extremism? And that is something, it's more like philosophical in a way, but that's some kind of question that appears when we apply this tool. And I think that's it. Let's summarize our preliminary study. It's very preliminary, and you're just exploring, and happy to hear your questions, your thoughts. Many thanks.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was such an interesting sort of look at what, the situation in Sri Lanka, which is quite distinct from what we have here in Australia. So if anyone has any questions, please post them in the Q&A. But I've had a couple of questions. A couple of them are my questions, but I have a couple of questions to start people off while everyone else is thinking. So the first question that we have is for Stephen. And the question is, where do protective factors come into this understanding of youth vulnerability and risk? While it's true that there's no vulnerability without exposure to risk, it's also true that vulnerability is offset by protections. So how do youth protective factors fit into your analysis and your work in New South Wales?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the notion of protective factors isn't specific to working with young people engaged with extremism. I think strengthening relative strengths or weaknesses in relation to youth is kind of part and parcel of youth practitioners and youth agencies across the spread of topics and risks and so on. So I suppose we're in a unique position in the youth criminal justice space where most of our clients are characterised by genuine and quite severe deficits in the presence of protective factors. So potentially we could swing the discussion from vulnerability to increasing protective factors, but really prominent in the way, I think we conceptualise youth across a host of different forums, and certainly in terms of safeguarding further exposure or influence from extremism. I think protective factors has to be a core part of the conversation in relation to youth when we're talking about CVE.
Thank you. And we now have a question for Emmanuel, Sanka and André, and I'm not sure which one of you will want to answer this, so I'll open it up for all of you. But the question is, the BRAVE has 5 factors, 2 of which are violent beliefs and violent behaviours. So how did these factors correlate with areas like the life satisfaction and marital status that you discussed in your research?
Let me take this. Hello, can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Cheers. All right. What we found is that when it came to violence-related behaviors and violence-related beliefs, that was very low on people that believe that their economic satisfaction was quite high, right? In contrast to things like how they see community and how they feel empowered, that is a bridging capital and a linking capital. So with the linking capital and bridging capital, they were really low, but with the violence-related beliefs, that they were really high on those. Yeah. Have I answered, or you need more background to this?
No, that was answered, okay. I think.
All right.
Thank you so much. And David and Deb, so Debra Smith has joined us as well. So the question for you guys, and this is my question. So you mentioned that there were some limitations with the TRAP 18 in terms of in the youth space in your data. Might this have something to do with what the risk specification is of the TRAP 18? So the TRAP 18 is, was designed exclusively for like the lone acts terrorism space, and we know in the lone acts terrorism space, a lot of them are much older. So is that something that you thought about, or do you have another idea what that could be?
Before Deb actually answers it correctly, I'm just going to jump in and say that even though TRAP 18 didn't show as many statistically significant results as the rest of the tools, it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with the tool itself. but comparatively, in that age group, there was a difference. Deb, fix it up for me, please.
Not at all. No, I think Emily's point is a really good one. And the thing is, I guess, is that this is what our data set showed, but our data set in itself is not a complete data set of every possibility. So I think that's always going to be a limitation. So yes, there, you know, you could make some speculation of the fact that if you did have a lone actor who was younger, potentially maybe that, you know, may not show, but it also might, because, you know, not all lone actors are going to be specific. We're dealing with, we're sort of generalizing out here. So it was something that came out in the data, but we certainly wouldn't be saying something like, oh, well, you know, you shouldn't be using TRAP for under 26s. I mean, what I would consistently say, and what our team consistently talks about, is it's best if you can use all the tools that you've got at this. It's just like maps. You know, you don't want the same map for somebody, you know, flying a plane as somebody bushwalking. So you should always try and pick a map that, because they help you see different things. And I would say that that philosophy would be carried through into these observations as well.
Thank you. And then just to follow up, are you guys still collecting data on this to sort of help build your database so you can carry on with these kind of analyses?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for us, it's just a case of the coding across everything takes a lot of time. And we're sort of weaving it in between other project work and that sort of thing. So we continue to keep building the amount of people in the data set, but we've got fairly strict criteria, but we still have some missing parts there. But yeah, we just keep building it. And we really spent, you know, to be honest, we spent pretty much COVID coding, you know, with the odd report. So we're only just sort of getting to play around a little bit in the data and see what we can learn from it. But yeah, our approach is really just to be really cautious about those limitations, because, you know, there are a lot, and, you know, we're trying to sort of also, you know, understand operationally what these kinds of things mean, because, you know, it's one thing to say something in a conference, it's another thing when you have, you know, operational sort of based reports. So, you know, we're going with caution. It's a starting point. Yeah.
All research is a starting point. I think everyone
Correct.
agree. Yeah. So I have a question from the Q&A, but before I ask it, everyone who's listening, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A, because I'm running out of questions to ask people. So come on, guys, ask some questions. So the first question we have from the Q&A is for Stephen. And the question is, the previous session focused on alternative narrative interventions that work pre-radicalization at the level at grassroots. These were considered in relation to youth resilience to violent extremism in the BRAVE measure. Would this be something that you would consider when working with young people instead of the more CVE approach?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm arguably not best placed to provide the response to it. So we have a really pronounced kind of counter-narrative social cohesion framework in New South Wales that sits, I suppose, on a continuum a long way before a CVE service like our unit in the youth criminal justice space would be employed. I think moving forward, there's certainly scope, and not just from a youth perspective, for that counter-narrative grassroots approach to marry up a little bit closer with some of those early intervention identification type CVE approaches. So I wouldn't say I have a compelling response that'll give us a lot to work with, but I think there's some scope for those two to get a little bit closer in terms of prevention, diversion, and ultimately trying to save us from having to talk about violent extremism in relation to youth. I don't think we've quite nailed that yet, but I think there's some scope to address that further if that's not too much of a neutral sitting on the fence type of response.
I don't think it is, but I didn't ask the question, so someone else might. So does anyone on the panel have any questions for anyone else on the panel? Because we have no questions. I
kind of have a I'm sort of thinking about Steve's presentation earlier, Steve, which I really enjoyed, and I enjoyed the one at the Risk Assessment Conference as well. So, I mean, what we've presented here is pretty much about increasing your workload and saying, well, we kind of think that this youth idea goes a little bit higher than 18. I'm curious as to, what, from your practitioner perspective, how that resonates with the sort of, your understanding of the space and that sort of extended adolescence period.
Probably a couple of things, Deb. In terms of increasing my workload, no, that doesn't resonate with me all that well at all. But I love David's commentary around the fact that if we look at the behavioural sciences, if we look at psychology, the notion of developmental vulnerability, for want of a better description, shouldn't just stop at the age of 18. And it makes a whole lot of sense for us to kind of remove this line in the sand. And I think our terrorism offender cohort in New South Wales is a really great example where you have a small number that convicted their offences below the age of 18 and spend a number of years in a very pluralistic, pro-social, case management-based correctional setting, and then a number that commit their offences just past the age of 18 that spend their time in custody in a very different environment, but arguably they have the same needs. So I don't mind the discussion around, can we stretch out this notion of adolescence, of youth, because it seems strange for us to have a cutoff at an age range when really the deficits, the needs, the protective factors, and all those kind of things that we talk about, you could argue that they're pretty consistent and they need to be addressed on both sides of that pre and post 18 line. So without question, I think there's some scope for us to open up that discussion, and it should be less, I think, about almost that criminal justice notion of pre and post 18. It's probably unhelpful, and I think we're missing some opportunities as a result of it.
Interesting.
Thanks for that. Right, I have a couple of questions, people. They're for Steve. So sorry, Steve. The first one is, what is your sort of reading of the level of education in the correctional system that's like being used to identify these radicalization sort of indicators? And then the follow-up to that is there a risk of stigmatization or sort of profiling in this system?
So we as an agency have a remit to work really hard around staff training, staff consultation, and I'm conscious it's not as simple as having a training package that gives staff a checklist of indicators that they can tick and then make a referral to a CVE framework. So it's not a perfect science, and I think that's a given across the board. I'm not sure that's unique to correctional settings. I suppose for us, we're very in tune with the notion of stigma, given that we work less with youth terrorism offenders and more with youth that are somewhere on that really broad spectrum. We have our own internal screening process that's incredibly robust, extremely consultative. We have external representation from child and adolescent forensic mental health services. We don't have a formal referral avenue, so we've tried to push a consultative type opportunity where rather than documenting things, rather than making a big deal about CVE, let's talk about it. Let's have a CVE framework that sees it through a youth lens, that's happy to consult about it. And before we go down the path of consequences or stigma or documentation, let's just engage a range of multidisciplinary practitioners from a range of agencies and see if we can't first understand vulnerability, to go back to the presentation, and then understand its relevance to radicalisation or violent extremism. But we've just tried internally to soften the living daylights out of the conversations that we're having. I'm conscious that might work for us and certainly mightn't work for others, but it's not necessarily the silver bullet. But I suppose for us, consultation is the term that we're using to try and remove the stigma and the profile and the scrutiny that comes with CVE. And we're training our staff to be comfortable talking about it. We're making our CVE unit quite kind of dynamic, quite small, quite non-intel centric, no legislation focus. And we're just trying to blend into the scenery in the youth justice, kind of youth agency type landscape where we're just practitioners. We're seeing youth through the lens of vulnerability and risk. And yes, the topic's a bit scary, but the conversations don't need to be scary. And if we can take the air out of the tyres a little bit around how people perceive CVE, we've had a bit of success around, I guess, that notion of stigma and labelling being reduced to some degree. But it's an enduring challenge. And whilst we feel okay about where we're at, that'll change and it will work in certain circumstances and it probably won't work in others. So I don't have a I don't have the solution, but we've worked really hard to just get people consulting, get people talking, and get people feeling a little bit more comfortable that the sooner we talk about it, the sooner we can do something about it, but purely from a practice-based perspective and less from an intelligence, law enforcement, legislative perspective. And we find that to some degree, the stigma label kind of CVE type flavour is taken away to some degree, but it's a work in progress.
And then very relatedly, but it's coming at it, it's trying to get you to get off the fence a little bit more, is should we be going for broke and just focus more on mainstreaming services that don't directly refer to CVE, or do we miss the opportunity to sort of understand and socialize what violent extremism is for young people by identifying these?
I won't sit on the fence for this one, Emily, and I think there's two pieces. I think we can mainstream the house down in terms of social cohesion and counter narratives and building resilient and pro-social and healthy young people. And you look at education settings and community organisations, absolutely. I would argue that doesn't need a CVE-specific lens to it. But the reality is we have a number of young people that are radicalised. We have a number of young people that are engaging clearly in extremism. And my concern is if you don't apply, I guess, a CVE lens in a practice-based perspective at that on the ground in the trenches type of level, I'm not sure we adequately assess. I'm not sure we adequately case manage, and I'm not sure we adequately divert or disengage. So that for me is a really small pocket of how we should be approaching all things youth CVE related. But I think front of house, absolutely, this can be a more broader social non-CVE flavour. But there are moments and there are times and there are a small number of youth clients where if we want to get this right from a community perspective and from a youth client perspective, I think we have to have some youth CVE expertise, skills or thinking applied, because without that, my concern is that we don't get it right. And at-risk and radicalised youth is not good for anyone. So if we're going to do the work with clients, we want to make sure that we nail it. So I think there's two sides to it. Front of house, yes. In practice on the ground with radicalised youth, I think we want to talk about youth CVE because I think that's what it's about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so because there are no more questions in the Q&A, I would like to end this session. I want to thank everyone for presenting. There were some fascinating presentations, really interesting Q&A, even though it seemed to be a lot of between us. Our next session actually starts at 6 o'clock, so you've got just under 45-minute break. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.